You would agree with me that one of the worst things about history is how women were treated unjustly. And on top of that, they were forced to suffer severe consequences for the pettiest offences. Imagine being burnt alive for forgery, or being dismembered for partaking in a religious movement. Don't believe it? Well, see for yourself. Here are 10 of the most brutal tortures done on women throughout centuries. Ducking stools. Ever heard of ducking stools? Well, they're not as comfortable as they sound. These devices are also known as cucking stools, and they were special chairs used as a form of punishment, especially for women in medieval Europe. They were specifically designed to discipline individuals who were accused of certain behaviors considered unacceptable at the time. Among those punished were women said to be talkative, gossips, and even business owners who were thought to be cheating their customers or engaging in unethical practices. The ducking stool itself was a really strong wooden chair to ensure it could withstand repeated use and the harsh conditions of the punishment process. The offender would be seated in the chair, and for added security, an iron band would be placed around her body. This iron band was very important because it ensured that the victim remained firmly in place and did not accidentally or intentionally fall out of the chair during the punishment. After securing the offender in place, the act of punishment then began. She would be fully immersed, chair and all, into a body of water, over and over again. Whenever a woman was sentenced to punishment using this ducking stool, the magistrates or judges would determine how many duckings she should endure. Basically, the number of duckings depended on the severity of the alleged offense. The idea of ducking was not only for physical discomfort, it also served as a form of public humiliation, as these events were often carried out in the presence of gathered crowds. In some unfortunate cases, the women actually died or had to deal with severe health complications for the rest of their lives, especially if they were weak from previous punishments. In fact, in medieval times, and up until the early 18th century, the practice of ducking was used as a means to determine whether a suspect was a witch. During this period, witch trials were common, and authorities believed that whenever a person, especially a child, went missing, it meant that a witch had kidnapped and eaten them. And so a suspect would be brought forward, and her right thumb would be bound tightly or nailed to her left big toe. After being secured, a rope was tied around her waist, and she was then thrown into a river or another body of water. The belief behind the test was that water was a pure element, and if the woman was a witch, she would be rejected by the water and she would just float. But if she wasn't a witch, she would sink to the bottom of the water. So it was more like a no-win situation. No matter the outcome, it meant only one thing: death. There have been cases where the woman was found innocent but still passed away due to negligence or various inhumane tests, such as this one. Ducking stools are truly terrible. But let's see what you think about branking. Branking. When we talk about branking, what instantly comes to mind is how cruel and dehumanizing it is. It is a form of torture that originated in Scotland during the 1500s. It was primarily targeted at women and was carried out using a device known as a scold's bridle, sometimes referred to as a witch's bridle. This instrument of torture was used as a tool to oppress and publicly humiliate women who were perceived as overly talkative or nagging. This metal contraption included a bridle piece, typically about 5 centimeters in size, which was forcibly inserted into the victim's mouth. This piece would press really hard on the tongue, and it had a sharp spike to restrict movement and cause a lot of discomfort. So, if the victim ever tried to say a word, the spike would pierce right through her tongue. As part of the punishment, a guard would parade the wearer around town on a leash. In fact, some versions of the bridle included a small bell attached to the frame. This bell would jingle as the victim moved, just to attract the attention of passers-by and draw a crowd. There are several documented cases in England where women were subjected to the brutal punishment of wearing a scold's bridle for reasons other than nagging or gossiping. Sometimes, women were targeted for their involvement in social protests or religious dissent. One well-known case is that of Dorothy Waugh, a woman from Westmoreland who became a Quaker during a time when those religious beliefs were considered controversial and threatening to what society considered as normal. Quakers are people who belong to the Religious Society of Friends, which is a historically Protestant Christian set of denominations. Members of this movement would refer to each other as friends, and their modus operandi was quite different from that of other Christian communities. Dorothy's story is particularly significant because she provided the only known written account of what it was like to endure this horrific punishment. The incident occurred when Dorothy was preaching in the marketplace of Carlisle, and at the time, preaching was considered highly inappropriate and immodest for a woman. The mayor of Carlisle, who was not in support of her and her Quaker faith, decided to punish her by placing her in a scold's bridle. She was forced to wear the device for 4 agonizing hours, after which she was briefly released, only to be thrown back into prison and subjected to the same punishment for another 4 hours. When Dorothy was finally released, her suffering still didn't end. The mayor saw to it that she was publicly whipped and driven out of town. For other women who were not driven out of town, they had to live with the stigma for the rest of their lives. Our ancestors were quite brutal back in the day, but this next torture method, they say, was used to haunt witches. Pricking and scratching. In the 16th and 17th centuries, a lot of innocent women were victims of the witch trials that were prevalent in Europe. At the time, certain natural body parts and body marks were considered witch marks, and this included moles, skin tags, patches of skin, birthmarks, and scars. Now, if witch hunters were unable to find any obvious evidence of a witch's marks on a suspect's body, they resorted to the cruel practice known as pricking to find such marks. As unbelievable as it may sound, there were witch-hunting books that were circulated at the time, and they explained that these supposed marks of a witch were insensitive to pain and did not bleed when pricked or cut. And so, these needles would be pushed into the skin, and the pricking would continue until the examiner found a spot that did not react like normal skin. If a spot was discovered that did not bleed or seem insensitive to pain, it was immediately assumed to be a witch's mark. In England and Scotland, the practice of pricking was usually carried out by professional prickers, swing, who were well paid for their work. However, many of these so-called professionals were actually con men who used the opportunity to exploit the situation for personal gain. Instead of using sharp needles, they would often use dull needle points, meaning that whenever they pricked the women, they would not bleed. But that's just for pricking. When it came to scratching, it was an entirely different story. The scratching test was based on the belief that people who were possessed by evil spirits would instinctively know who their tormentor was, and so they would experience a form of relief from their symptoms if they were able to scratch the person responsible for causing their condition. If the scratching resulted in drawing blood from the accused, it was seen as an indication that the person was indeed guilty of being a witch. Most women who went through this horrible experience ended up being labeled as witches, and that meant only one thing: death. Next up is an ancient Chinese tradition that scarred many women for centuries: foot binding. Foot binding was an ancient but extremely disturbing custom practiced in China, where the feet of young girls were deliberately broken and tightly bound to change the natural shapes and sizes. It is believed that the practice of foot binding may have originally started with court dances during the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period, which took place in the 10th century in China. Some historical accounts say that the custom began as a way for dancers, particularly those in the imperial court, to create smaller and more delicate-looking feet that could be seen as more graceful while they were performing. Sad as it is, this tradition started right from the little girls. The process of foot binding typically began before the arch of the foot had a chance to develop fully, being swing, usually when the girl was between the ages of 4 and 9. The first step was to soak each foot in a mixture of herbs and animal blood. Then, the feet were tightly wrapped with a silk cloth to bend the toes downward and inward, and most times it caused the feet to break and the bones to deform. What exactly was the goal of foot binding, you may ask? This practice was used to achieve what they believed to be the ideal foot shape, often referred to as lotus feet. These feet were small, delicate, and were thought to be a sign of beauty, grace, and femininity in Chinese culture. The shoes made to fit these deformed feet were called lotus shoes, and they were specially made to accommodate the tiny, misshapen feet resulting from the binding process. Women with lotus feet were often seen as more desirable and were thought to possess a certain refined beauty that was highly valued in late imperial China. In fact, bound feet soon became a symbol of high status and wealth. It was believed that only those from wealthy families could afford to bind their daughters' feet, and at some point, even the poor started to bind the feet of their female children just to increase their marriage prospects. However, as the feet were bound tighter, they became more deformed. Walking became increasingly difficult, and many women who had their feet bound in this way ended up with disabilities that they had to manage for the rest of their lives. Some other women experienced deformed toes, missing nails, and a constant struggle to walk or maintain balance. This gruesome tradition continued for decades, and it was only in the early 20th century, as China began to modernize, that foot binding was gradually outlawed and phased out. You might want to sit tight for the next torture method. It was used to rip and tear out body parts. The breast ripper. The breast ripper, also referred to as the iron spider or simply the spider, is exactly what it sounds like, and it was an instrument used as a tool of torture against women. This device was specially designed to inflict severe physical and emotional pain, as well as permanent disfigurement by tearing the breasts from a woman's body. The use of this horrendous device is most commonly associated with the Middle Ages, and you know how harsh things got during that period. In fact, the concept of targeting women in this way dates back even earlier, as similar methods were also used in ancient Rome. Some historical accounts confirm that Christian martyrs, such as Agatha of Sicily and Saint Barbara, were subjected to such brutalities. Both women were tortured by having their breasts torn off before eventually being killed for their beliefs. Other women who were out through this harsh torture said to have taken part in various so-called crimes or negative involvements. These accusations could range from acts of infidelity and adultery to witchcraft or heresy. What's worse is, the degree of their punishment was decided upon by male judges or authorities who had absolutely no mercy. On its own, the breast ripper was a horrifying instrument of torture, but it was also often heated to further heighten the woman's pain. The device typically consisted of 4 sharp claws, each designed to latch onto the victim's breast with brutal force. The claws were used to slowly rip the breasts from the woman's body, and one can only imagine the amount of pain and physical damage it caused. At the end of the day, most of the women would die from the extreme blood loss and trauma caused by the torture. And even if she made it far enough to endure it, she would eventually be killed by beheading. Although the breast ripper was out of use quite early, it had caused a lot of women a lot of pain. But with the next form of torture, we're just getting started. Pair of anguish. The pair of anguish, also referred to as the choke pear, is a device with quite a terrifying reputation. And I must say, this might be a lot to take in. Although its actual historical use remains a subject of debate among historians, the torture device was said to have been invented during the early modern period. Just looking at the design, it's horrifying. It consists of a metal body shaped like a pear, which is divided into a number of spoon-like segments. These segments are connected to a central mechanism that allows them to be spread apart, either by the activation of a spring or by turning a key that controls the device. Now, this is where it gets scary. According to accounts and interpretations of its function, the pair of anguish was used to inflict pain by inserting it into one of three areas of the body: the mouth, rectum, or the female genitals, depending on the intended form of torture or humiliation. Once inserted, the pear-shaped segments would be expanded, and the orifice would stretch out in unimaginable ways. This expansion could be so severe that it could result in gagging, tearing, or mutilation of the affected area. However, history has it that there are no contemporary first-hand accounts of the pair of anguish being used in actual practice. Those who insist on its practical use have concluded that the absence of records could be because the device was used in secret, away from public view, by individuals such as kidnappers or other criminals who operated outside the law. It is suggested that kidnappers or interrogators might have employed the device as a cruel method of silencing their victims or coercing them into compliance. Others, however, say that the lack of first-hand accounts could also be due to the shame or stigma associated with the supposed use of the device. Victims who endured torture of this degree might have been reluctant to share their experiences because they fear judgment or ostracization from society. Well, if you look at it from another perspective, maybe it's not as bad as this next method: amputation. In ancient China, there was punishment done through amputation known as yue that was used for a wide variety of offenses. This system of punishment lasted for many centuries and applied to more than 500 different crimes. The offenses could range from serious crimes like stealing, rebelling, and cheating to seemingly minor offenses such as climbing over certain gates or breaking other specific laws. In fact, it was not the only form of punishment used for serious crimes. It was just one of 5 major punishments reserved for the most severe offenses. Along with yue, other punishments included methods such as boiling the offender to death, tattooing the face or forehead, and cutting off the nose. However, yue was not a punishment that was applied equally to everyone. In fact, the system of punishments in ancient China was heavily biased, with laws and punishments that were much more severe for women than for men. For example, when it came to the crime of adultery, the punishment for a man was often less harsh than for a woman who was caught in the same act. If a woman was found guilty of committing adultery, the punishment could be incredibly severe. In some cases, she could face the amputation of any part of her body, depending on the circumstances and the severity of her crime. On the other hand, a man caught committing adultery could often face a much less extreme consequence. In many cases, he might only receive a punishment like flogging, or he could be made to pay a fine. Overall, the Yayoi was harder on women than men, and this story just proves it. In 2022, a shocking discovery was made in Beijing. Scientists uncovered the 3,000-year remains of a young woman, and upon examination, it was discovered that her foot had been amputated. When the scientists examined the remains, they saw that she had no prior ailments. When the ends of the bones were carefully examined, there were no indications of illness and rough edges, in contrast to those typically seen in surgical removals. And because of the growth on the bones, they concluded that she had been subjected to this particular form of punishment. Thankfully, the Yue punishment has been abolished, but this next method will leave you with a lot of questions. Stoning. Stoning, also known as lapidation, is a brutal and ancient method of capital punishment, in which a group of people throws stones at a person until the victim succumbs to death from blunt trauma. In fact, this is not regarded as a method torture, but rather as a method of execution. It has been recorded throughout history, dating back to ancient civilizations, and it has been used as a form of punishment for a variety of serious offenses. In many cases, stoning has been linked to offenses such as adultery, blasphemy, or other actions considered to be grave moral transgressions by certain societies or religious groups. One of the most tragic and horrifying recent instances of stoning occurred in early April 2007, when Dua Khalil Aswad, a 17-year-old Iraqi girl, was stoned to death in a town located in Nineveh. Aswad's death was a result of what is known as an honor killing, a practice where a person, usually a woman, is murdered by family members or community members. After she supposedly wrongs them, they murder her in order to preserve the perceived honor of the family or community. In Aswad's case, however, their motives are unclear. According to some accounts, she was killed because she converted to Islam in order to wed a Sunni Muslim lad from Iraq. According to other stories, Aswad was killed as retribution for missing one night of her home. What's worse is that the incident would have remained unknown until a footage surfaced on the internet from an anonymous user. The terrifying execution was carried out in a public setting, with a crowd of people watching and participating. Dua Khalil Aswad was taken to the town square, where she was stripped of her clothing from the waist down, leaving her with just her jacket and underwear. Interestingly, some people in the crowd tried to cover her lower body with another jacket, perhaps out of some sense of decency or to shield her from further embarrassment. The stoning itself lasted around 30 minutes. The whole time, Aswad kept trying to sit up and calling for help, but her cries were ignored as the crowd continued to throw large rocks and chunks of concrete at her head. Unfortunately, she passed away after several minutes of torture, bearing multiple wounds and injuries. But they didn't stop there. Once they confirmed her dead, her body was tied to a car and dragged through the streets, and after that, she was buried with the remains of a dog. If this was their idea of an honor killing, maybe the world needs to redefine the meaning of that word. This tragic incident prompted a global campaign that was launched that same year to stop the killing and stoning of women. Before that time, in many countries, stoning was used as a punishment for those accused of engaging in sexual intercourse outside the bounds of marriage. According to interpretations of Islamic criminal law, sexual relations between a man and a woman outside a valid marriage contract is considered a serious crime. In these instances, the typical punishment for married offenders is stoning to death. However, the campaign hasn't succeeded in certain parts of the world, and the stoning practice has actually been codified into law in several countries, including Sudan, Pakistan, Iran, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and northern Nigeria. Next up is the Spanish donkey, but unfortunately, it isn't as pleasant as it sounds. The Spanish donkey was a cruel and infamous torture device used in medieval and early modern times. There were two main variations of this torture device, both of which operated on the same basic principle. The more the body weight, the deeper the pain. This wooden horse typically consisted of a triangular wooden structure with a sharp, narrow edge at the top. The woman was then forced to sit astride this sharp edge, often completely naked, with her legs on either side, in an open position. However you're imagining it now, it's much worse. If she ever tried to escape, to shift their weight to reduce the pain, her legs were tied with ropes to keep them apart and secure. Now, the process of torture began. She would be lowered slowly onto the sharp edge of the wooden horse, and her entire body weight would press down on the narrow beam. Imagine that amount of pain. The most well-known variation of the wooden horse is a triangular device with one point of the triangle facing upward. This sharp point is mounted on a support that resembles a sawhorse, and the victim is forced into this position and is made to straddle the pointed triangular horse. In history, this has to be one of the most horrifying torture devices, especially because suffering was sometimes prolonged until the woman passed out from pain or exhaustion. These injuries sustained could cause lasting damage, and the woman may not be able to walk for months. In many cases, the injury was so severe that it left the woman crippled for the rest of her life. So far, we've considered a number of hideous torture methods used on women throughout the centuries. Burning. In England, death by burning was a legal punishment that was imposed on women who were found guilty of high treason, petty treason, and heresy during both the Middle Ages and the early modern period. This method of execution was carried out over several centuries, and women were burned at the stake in public under the guise of being punished for crimes. These crimes ranged from making counterfeit money to mariticide, which is the killing of one's husband. Women accused of witchcraft, heresy, or other so-called crimes against God, and the state could also face this horrific punishment. However, it is quite interesting that men who were convicted of heresy were also subjected to burning at the stake, but those who committed high treason, which is an even more serious offense against the crown, were not burned. Instead, these men were sentenced to a different form of execution, being hanged, drawn, and quartered. As a matter of fact, public executions were major events, and large crowds would come to watch. People came from all over, and it wasn't just regular townsfolk. Sometimes, high-ranking officials and even the royalty would attend. One of the most notable cases was the execution of Anne Askew in 1546. She was accused of heresy and had first been horribly tortured at the Tower of London. For her execution, they built a special stage for the event. This stage wasn't just for Anne, but also for the officials who were in charge of overseeing her execution. They had a clear view of everything from up there. A witness who was there reported that Anne was already so badly hurt from the torture that she couldn't even stand on her own. Despite this, she was still brought out to be burned at the stake, and the whole thing was done in front of a satisfied crowd. 2 centuries after that, a counterfeiter named Catherine Murphy and her husband, Hugh Murphy, were both convicted of coining. The trial took place at the Old Bailey in London, and on the 18th of September, 1788, they were both sentenced to death. On the morning of the 18th of March, 1789, Catherine and Hugh Murphy faced their execution at Newgate Prison, along with 7 other men who were found guilty of various related crimes. But what happened was quite odd. The 7 men and Hugh Murphy were hanged, as was the standard method of execution for male convicts. Catherine Murphy, however, faced a more horrendous fate just because she was a woman. Catherine was led past the hanging bodies of the men and brought to a prepared execution site, where she was made to stand on a small platform. She was tied to the stake, and once she had finished saying her prayers, the executioner, William Brune's Skill, did the unthinkable. He carefully piled faggots of straw around the base of the stake, and when everything was in place, he lit the straw and set Catherine ablaze. Anyone should be truly appalled by these acts, and the more you think about the cruelty behind these torture methods and so-called punishments, the more you begin to understand why women in recent times have refused to be silenced as far as equality and fairness are concerned. Thanks for sticking around. If this video left you shocked or curious, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you want to see more intriguing videos. See you next time.